Rantanen, Director of Technology for Southern California Travel Chairmen's Association.
Shana England, Director of the Digital Equity Initiative at the California Community Foundation.
Thank you all. Before we start this discussion on this topic, let's have a short presentation on this topic from Ben.
Great. Thank you, Ali, and thank you again to all of our panelists and attendees in the room and online. This panel will focus on project selection rules. Next slide, please. So there are multiple project selection requirements that are specified in the Notice of Funding Opportunity, or NOFO, that our rules that are established in the initial proposal will have to optimize and balance. Some of these include prioritizing complete coverage of unserved locations, then underserved locations, and then providing gigabit service to community anchor institutions and funding non-deployment subgrants. So that prioritization is a requirement that the state establish a plan to serve unserved locations as defined in the statute, then underserved locations, and then gigabit service to community anchor institutions as funding permits. Another requirement that our project selection rules will have to optimize for is to solicit applications on a geographic basis that will achieve complete coverage of locations. And so this is potentially a little different from some of the other state broadband grant programs where applicants have been free to draw their own project areas. One of the specific things that NTIA is looking for in our initial proposal is an understanding that project areas will encourage applications for all unserved locations and not allow cherry picking. Another requirement that has to be prioritized as part of project selection is to prioritize fiber deployment as much as is feasible, as well as prioritizing what the NOFO defines as reliable broadband technologies where feasible. We'll have a panel a little bit later today on establishing the extremely high cost per location threshold, which is an integral part of both of those, of both prioritizing fiber and reliable broadband technologies. But in general, BEAD has a preference for fiber. It's fiber first, but it's not fiber only. And then finally, I want to highlight that the project selection rules must utilize a subgrantee selection scoring criteria or a rubric of points that are aligned with the BEAD NOFO program goals. And the next slide gets into some of these in more specifics. So the scoring requirements for BEAD are in part established by the NOFO and in part are free for us to determine as part of the initial proposal. In selecting subgrantees, the CPUC must utilize a scoring rubric of points and award subgrantees on the basis of that scoring. The scoring rubric is split into primary scoring criteria and secondary scoring criteria, again established by the NOFO. The primary scoring criteria must account for at least 75% of available points according to the rubric. And these are defined by the NOFO as minimum BEAD program outlay, affordability, and fair labor practices. For the minimum BEAD program outlay primary scoring criterion, that refers to the total BEAD funding required for the project's completion. The affordability primary scoring criterion is specifically defined as the most affordable total price to the customer for 1 gigabit symmetrical service for priority broadband projects, and that means end-to-end fiber projects, or for 120 megabits per second service for other last mile broadband deployment projects, so non-fiber deployments. And then finally, the NOFO requires us to prioritize fair labor practices, meaning a record and commitment to be in compliance with federal labor and employment laws, as well as applicable state labor and employment laws. So those three criteria need to be part of the primary scoring criteria and must be the basis for at least 75% of our scoring rubric. The secondary scoring criteria cannot count for more than 25% of all points, and no secondary criterion may count more than any primary scoring criterion. So the NOFO defines two specific secondary scoring criteria, but allows definition of additional secondary criteria that meet those requirements. The NOFO defines a speed to deployment secondary criterion, which applies to both priority broadband projects and non-priority and other last-mile broadband deployment projects. And that means that the binding commitment to complete deployment by a date certain. So the faster the project can be completed, the more points it would get. The other secondary scoring criterion defined in the NOFO is the speed of network or other technical capabilities criterion, and this only is required to apply to other last-mile broadband deployment projects, so non-fiber projects. And this requires prioritization based on the greater scalability or longer useful life of the technology funded. So essentially, the speed that the technology can support and other technical characteristics can result in additional points. As I mentioned, within the context of secondary scoring criteria and within the context of these defined scoring criteria that are required, the CPUC may define other scoring criteria in evaluating projects. Next slide. So finally, after soliciting applications on a project area basis that will encourage complete coverage, the CPUC must engage in certain post-application activities before making awards. These include deconflicting overlapping applications if necessary, so to the extent that applicants are able to draw their own project areas that could potentially overlap, the CPUC must conduct a deconfliction process to allow like-for-like comparison of competing proposals and scoring between those projects. The CPUC must also score the applications and determine the winners for areas with applications received. And then finally, for areas that did not receive applications, the NTIA is encouraging states to engage prospective subgrantees for any of those areas that did not receive applications and negotiate any necessary inducements to obtain applications for those locations. This process must be as transparent as possible and remain fair, particularly by defining rules for how that post-application inducement and negotiation process will function. But it is part of getting to complete coverage, even if areas do not receive applications. I believe that is my last slide.
Thank you, Ben. So now let's move to the next slide. These are the questions that we are going to discuss with our panelists. The question is going to be on the screen, but I'm just going to read them quickly. And then we are going to have the discussion, the same process as our first panel this morning, asking our panelists to limit their comments to 5 minutes. So I'm going to read the questions. If applicants are allowed to construct their own project areas, what mechanism should be used to, 1, ensure complete coverage of unserved and or underserved locations, and 2, deconflict overlapping proposals? If project areas are predefined, are these pre-existing geographies such as counties, tribal lands, or cities that should be used, or should project areas be drawn based on clusters of unserved or underserved locations? How should the required scoring criteria, including affordability, labor standards, minimum BEAD outlay, speed to deployment, and technical capabilities, be applied to individual projects and weighted within a rubric? Are there additional scoring criteria such as awarding points on the basis of equity or climate resilience that should be included? How should those points be awarded? In the post-application process, how should the Commission prioritize identifying applicants to remaining unserved or underserved locations not included in an application? What inducements should be used to encourage applications for those locations? Now we are going to start with our consumer advocates participants. We have 3 panelists on this: Eileen, Kaylee, and Caroline. So to start, and please limit your total comments to 5 minutes.
So thank you, Commission staff, Commissioner Hauk. Thank you all for letting us speak today. I am speaking on behalf of the Public Advocate's Office and in general on behalf of the Center for Accessible Technology and for TURN. Consumer advocates here are concerned with cherry picking, leaving out redlined and other historically disadvantaged communities. There's certainly nuance between our positions as consumer advocates on how to prevent this, and folks may expound upon those in comments. Cal Advocates believes that predefined project areas are the best way to efficiently ensure complete coverage of unserved locations and to generate apples-to-apples project comparisons within the BEAD timeline. Of the 12 states that have submitted their initial proposal, Volume 2, to the NTIA as of about 4 o'clock yesterday, all 12 have proposed predefined project area units based either on geographic or political boundaries like census blocks, census block groups, unified school districts, or based on commission-generated, state-generated clusters of unserved and underserved locations. All states but one require project proponents to apply to serve all eligible locations within those predefined project areas. Vermont requires 95%. The Commission should designate census block level project area units, allowing applicants to propose projects covering one or more census blocks, but committing to serve all eligible unserved locations in each census block applied for. Census block level project units allow applicants more flexibility in defining overall project areas given their relatively smaller size and would allow for greater participation from non-traditional providers. As the state of Louisiana noted in their draft initial proposal, Volume 2, this methodology allows prospective subgrantees wide flexibility to define their own proposed overall deployment projects, provided that such proposals are submitted in the form of sets of predefined project areas. I'm going to move in to talk about respond to the second question. However, there are too many scoring criteria to adequately cover all of them in this venue, so I'm going to focus on those that we consider of primary importance, and that's affordability. Our opening comments on the OIR filed on April 17th relay our preferences for the way each scoring criteria should be afforded in a rubric, but in short, if the Commission does not intend to adopt comprehensive affordable rate plan requirements for low-income and middle-class Californians, given the mandate to ensure that BEAD-funded projects deliver affordable service, affordability should be the primary and most heavily weighted criterion applied when deciding between competing projects. This primary criterion should be applied to individual projects as an assessment of the relative affordability of plans offered at the 1 gigabit symmetric level, 500, 100 megabits per second level, 100, 100 level, and 120 megabits per second level. The Commission should assess affordability at each of these levels to induce applicants to propose lower rates for a wider range of plans than just the 1 gigabit plan referred to in the NOFO for priority broadband projects. The Commission should consider awarding points either only to the cheaper of the plans offered by each competing application at each speed threshold, or awarding points to each plan based on the proposed rates variation from a reference point, as proposed by the state of Illinois. The applicant should be required to commit to offering these rates at no more than proposed in the application for 5 years following project completion to earn those points. While the NOFO provides a bare-bone description of this comparison point, the Commission should consider aspects of the plan under comparison beyond price and speed, including any other initial or recurring costs to the customer or data caps. Plans that have marginally lower service costs, but that also have data caps or larger deposits or activation fees should not be preferred. That's a lot of detail for this response here, and I am going to yield my time.
Thank you.
Thank you all for allowing me to speak today, and I would like to note that my comments are focused on the questions pertaining to additional scoring criteria in the project selection process. As previously stated in our opening comments in April on the OER, we request that the Commission prioritize the direction of resources to disadvantaged communities, along with the provision of open access networks and lifetime affordability agreements for built infrastructure. Additional equity provisions are also needed in the final scoring criteria to ensure that the lowest income and most disadvantaged communities are well positioned to combat private sector disinvestment, which has allowed for the proliferation of the digital divide and digital redlining in many of these communities. We're also in support of a clearly defined rubric with additional points being offered for applicants who prioritize low-income communities of color using tools such as SEVI or CalEnviro screens that are used for additional state programs, being made publicly available to all applicants in order to encourage such equitable investments. And in the case of duplicative projects, we would support the final determinations being made in a manner that is equally minded of disadvantaged communities and prioritizes using either the SEVI or CalEn screen in eligible locations. And in a state as large as California, it is also essential that greater consideration is given to the climate resilience of proposed BEAD projects to maximize the impact of this once-in-a-lifetime federal investment. GLI is adamant in our request for greater affordability requirements for the full built life of federal broadband infrastructure projects, in addition to any other shorter term affordability commitments. And we believe in the absence of meaningful affordability requirements that go beyond traditional short-term timeframes, this program could possibly not be a steward of taxpayer funds effectively. Thank you.
Thank you. So let's turn to our online panelists.
Oh.
Kelly? We can't hear you if you're speaking.
How about now?
Great, we can hear you. Thanks.
Okay. Apologies for that. The Communications Workers of America, CWA, is a labor union whose members are workers broadband networks. I will speak on labor standards, a statute. CWA, we like to.
Sorry, you're cutting in and out.
I'm not sure what else I might change.
That seems better. Go ahead, hopefully.
Okay, I guess it's a physical thing. Apologies. So I will speak on labor standards, a statutory priority. We like to highlight the jobs part of the infrastructure. The BEAD NOFO requires that labor standards receive substantial weight, and CWA recommends that labor standards receive a third of the weight given to the three primary. Volume 2 proposals of other states released so far are similar. For example, Delaware allocating 20% and Nevada 20% to labor standards. As recognized by the state of California in its high road labor policies, labor standards support effective programs and uninterrupted build, and points allocated to labor standards are well spent, supporting multiple objectives. The Commission should also ensure the fair labor practices category is as effective as possible by adding additional factors to its consideration of plans to be in compliance, including prioritizing a directly employed workforce for broadband deployment, installation, and maintenance, robust in-house training programs, family-sustaining wages and benefits, and policies that support job creation for tribal members and other disadvantaged communities. Additionally, collecting and publishing information regarding sub-grantees' workforce plans is a simple way to multiply the benefits of labor standards requirements and allows the public and worker organizations to be an ally in enforcement and accountability. Thank you for your time and work on the program.
Thank you. So now we move on to our community reps on the panel. Scott.
I'm in. Good afternoon again. Scott Armstrong, Regional Broadband Coordinator for Inyo-Mono counties. So this is an interesting problem to solve from the perspective of the rural counties, because we realize that selecting projects to get the most coverage generally looks at larger populations. And when you're looking at towns of 19,000, 25,000, you know, you can make a case for that. When you're looking at counties of 12,000 and 19,000, it's a bit more of a challenge. So what I'd like to offer is what I saw as an intent in the FFA applications for the providers applying for grants to partner with county governments and tribal governments. I think that would be a useful scoring amount to include in this as well. I think what Matt Rantana described earlier with full awareness of what the project application is going to be would be critical. I think the intent of FFA was to get to that, but I think as we saw with our first round, it didn't quite get us what we needed. So I think that using the county governments and the tribal nations to really truly partner with the providers and award points for that partnership, I think that would help. The county governments and the tribal nations know where where the gaps are, large or small. And it's easier for me to see the problem in my area because we have 19,000 people in our county, and it's the second largest by land county in the state. So as far as deconflicting overlapping applications, I think that would solve that problem. And I do like the idea of using census blocks or groups of census blocks as project definitions, primarily because the federal government and the state government already have so much information associated with that. It'll make it easier to associate data in maps and reports at that level. I think the county itself as a project area might be a little bit too large to focus on. I think I'd like to stop at that point, but thanks.
Thank you. So Georgia, next.
Great. Thank you again for inviting me here today. Georgia Savage from Oakland Undivided. In response to the first question, de-conflict overlapping proposals, I want to first uplift the comments made by my fellow panelist, Caroline from Greenlighting. Oakland Undivided agrees that in the case of overlapping proposals, the Commission should develop a point system that allows the CPUC to prioritize projects with the largest weight given to disadvantaged communities. And disadvantaged communities can be defined using existing metrics such as the 50% of communities with the highest SEVI score or Callen-Virus screen disadvantaged community. In the case of Oakland, this would certainly benefit the communities that have been historically redlined and we know have the least connected residents. For question 2, I also want to respond to that, particularly the question, should project areas be drawn based on clusters of unserved, underserved locations? In short, our answer is no. Project areas should not be drawn based on clusters of unserved, underserved locations. As I know many of you are aware, since February and as recent as yesterday at the California Broadband Council meeting, equity advocates from across the state have provided the CPUC with evidence of inaccurate data in the current FFA maps. And as seen from Patrick, who presented on panel 1, the visuals there show that the FFA maps have fabricated need in the wealthiest areas of our county. In Alameda County, that's Pleasanton, that's Dublin. And we've used the publicly available tools the ISPs have provided, such as Comcast and AT&T lookup tools, and we can verify that these locations are actually already being served at extremely high speeds. On the other end of that, we see understated needs in the lowest income historically redlined communities. And once again, Patrick presented our work with Hubble IQ and OUSD. We're using student Chromebooks to run speed tests at home. And in only 30 days, we were able to see density of red dots in East and West Oakland, these historically redlined communities that vastly outnumber the dots that we see on the FFA map. And that was only in a time period of a month. On the topic of clusters, we're also seeing clusters in wealthier communities and more sparse dots in lower income communities, which makes these areas obviously more competitive for grants. So our primary question is, how will the process for creating this map be different from the creation of the FFA map? If it's created using the same process, we obviously expect the same results, which is a demonstrably inaccurate map that results in disparate impact. We understand that starting with the FCC fabric is rough given the inaccuracies there, but obviously NTIA has communicated we can use our best available data, so I want to uplift what Lindsay from CADE said in panel 1, that this is a really important juncture in which the CPUC can respond to these community calls for a transparent process of creating this map in partnership with the community, which we hope will reflect more on the ground truth. And lastly, question 4, additional scoring criteria, such as awarding points on the basis of equity. We want to refer to advocates, first of all, really encourage equity considerations in the rubric. However, we do want to reference that for last mile FFA rubric, section G, which was targeted at identifying communities, disadvantaged communities, and prioritizing those. Unfortunately, the last additions to the FFA scoring rubric diluted equity points in 2 critical ways. The first of which that there was no scoring gradient. So in nearly every other major category, such as match or type of partnership, the CPUC awarded partial points. But for this equity category, it was all or nothing. So applicants were either awarded the 20 points or not, which is obviously a sizable amount of points for that application. And if there's ever a category to award partial points, it's definitely the equity-based metric. So Cal and virus green communities are the most vulnerable and marginalized in the state, so the full 20 points should be awarded to those communities and reserved for those farthest from opportunity. The second point we want to raise is the definition for disadvantage. As it stood in the FFA definition, this could include California's wealthiest communities. So the CPUC was awarding the full 20 points to projects where 50% of the unserved locations are incredibly wealthy, so long as the least 50% of the locations are at or below 80% of the median household income, state or county, whichever is higher. So this led to some applicants cherry picking projects to ensure they receive the points. For example, in San Francisco, a project serving Noe Valley could earn that 20 points for disadvantaged communities so long as they included a sliver of the mission. And we believe this is inequitable and not the intention of this category. So to summarize, we do believe the points should be awarded on the basis of equity by including disadvantaged communities, but we need to make this a gradient score, and we need to redefine disadvantaged communities using the previously proposed definition, 50% of communities with the highest SEVI score or Cal and virus green disadvantaged community. Thank you.
Thank you. Now let's turn to Shayna England from CCF, who is with us remotely.
Hi, thank you for having me. I'm going to stay off video because totally appropriately, I'm working in the field today with a community partner in downtown Los Angeles, where the internet is expensive and can best be described as iffy. so that you can continue to hear me, I'm going to stay off video. I'm Shayna England, Director of the Digital Equity Initiative at the California Community Foundation and co-convener of the Digital Equity LA Coalition. We're going to address the two questions regarding project area definitions and the two questions regarding scoring. Big picture, first, we do want to second the comments you heard this morning from my colleague Natalie, my fellow panelists just now, Georgia, and really all community advocates for quite some time now, that broadly the BEAD process, rules, and approach must be more inclusive of community-led ground-based truths and more consistently and effectively center equity than the federal funding account or other passive funding programs have to date. And generally speaking, we encourage the Commission to adopt as watchwords as they think about this as community, equity, and transparency. So getting to specifics, we believe that project applicants should broadly be allowed to define their own project areas around complete census blocks or census block groups, but to protect against the demonstrated practice on the part of incumbent ISPs of cherry picking the most lucrative areas over those most in need, there should be an appealable requirement to serve every location in the chosen area and a requirement to demonstrate that the project area encompasses the entirety of what could be locally defined as a community. So some examples of this that make this practicable: in the city of Los Angeles, there are neighborhood area councils with specific boundaries. In other cities, and actually in the city of LA, there are local electoral districts, city council or school board. And absent these kinds of official boundaries, affidavits or other community-based affirmations of what those boundaries are could serve. And on this, we also want to be very clear that we defer to tribal leaders regarding project areas in this way on and around tribal lands. Regarding the question of deduplicating locations in proposed project areas, we would advocate, in addition to what you've heard from our partners and who we second at Greenlighting and Oakland Undivided, we would advocate for a right of first refusal for projects that are municipal and community driven, and those that are partnered with municipal or community organizations, as the gentleman from Inyo mentioned. And in the case where duplication is versus to private providers, there's with no partners or any connection to this more public, preference should go to the applicant that scores the highest on equity, affordability, and labor metrics. We wholly reject basing project areas on clusters of unserved or underserved locations, given, as Georgia mentioned, the very well-documented reality that the state's mapping of those locations is consistently and systematically flawed, with imagined clusters of need and wealthy communities and disappeared need and low-income communities. Georgia mentioned examples in Alameda County. Here, where I'm sitting in LA, our community of Culver City, which is wholly served by Charter and by Ting and pockets from AT&T, has many dense clusters of showing need on the maps, whereas the community of MacArthur Park, which has about a 35% disconnected rate, and we have documented time and time again, large buildings serving low-income communities that have no service at all on the maps show no need. We could come up with example after example after example. The existing maps and how the CPUC is looking at what is an unserved or underserved cluster is perhaps irretrievably broken. Affordability and labor standards, including local hire and equity, should be weighted significantly more heavily than speed to deployment and technical capabilities. Fast and inequitable is worse than slower and actually contributing to solving the digital divide. And with respect to affordability, we think the FFA model as originally envisioned is a reasonable starting point. Applicants should be required to commit to a maximum price for the life of the publicly funded infrastructure, with the requirement transferred in the event of a sale or merger, and with the price adjustable over time for inflation or other market-driven factors in collaboration with CPUC. We also want to flag here the underuse of the Commission's extensive affordability rulemaking. We urge an urgent updated report producing current areas of affordability concern and affordability ratio data for the state, and the use of the Public Advocate's Office recent report on broadband pricing to identify additional metrics that may be useful with respect to pricing practices that affect affordability. And finally, with respect to equity metrics, the Commission should take to heart an early lesson from FFA as we are learning this week, and ensure that the equity score is not a switch, but a dial. The PUC, as George just mentioned, awards the full 20 points to projects where up to 50% of unserved locations are wealthy, so long as at least 50% of the locations are at or below 80% of median household income at the state or county level, whichever is higher. So that is a very easily gamed 20 points, and our analysis of FFA applications by private providers showed that they have indeed gamed it. So we see many projects that are mostly serving high income, low need communities, and then they maybe jut out to collect a block of apartment complexes in order to hit that kind of laughable threshold for disadvantaged community. So we recommend, along with Oakland Divided and others, a dial there.
Thank you. Now we are almost halfway through our panelists for this session. Just a quick pause to see if Commissioner or Judge, you have any questions so far.
Just a question, and maybe direct it to the counties and to Mr. Rantanen. Can you talk a little bit more about what you anticipated regarding partnerships? So the suggestion was that if a carrier is going to partner with the counties, that it be treated similarly to what the NOFO requires for tribes, or would you be looking to have some sort of additional points that would be put in there if a carrier can show that they've coordinated and are working directly with the tribes?
I know we have that it's in the NOFO for the tribes already, right? And if we had something similar for the counties, and we were able to truly emphasize criteria that a provider would have to meet to get those points, that would be very useful. And I'll explain where that's coming from. So we had, during the FFA application process, we had one provider who did show me maps of where they're going to cover, so I knew that they were hitting areas that needed to be covered. They were already on our list to knock out. We had another provider who said, yep, around this town. Never got any detail on it. It got to the point where we weren't going to be able to realistically sign a letter of support for a project that we had no definition of. And I understand the sensitivity of what a provider is trying to plan for. They don't want to show their hand too much, but if we're going to build out to everywhere, there will have to be some trust. And fortunately, I said I'll sign an NDA, whatever, but I'd like to see where you're gonna build out, and that worked for us. And so I think that level, other than just, hey, I'm going to cover your area, sign this letter the week that it's due, isn't realistic, because the county boards and the city boards, they want to know what the plans are, and they're not really in the driver's seat when I have to tell them after the fact, oh yeah, these applications went in. They need to know ahead of time that the applications are going to go in. And so if that makes sense, if that comes across right, what I'm looking for is real, true engagement and partnering between the county governments, the tribes, and the providers who are putting in the applications.
And I don't know if any of the providers wanted to comment on how they're coordinating with any of the local governments or...
I do have a comment too. This is Matt Rantanen.
Oh, go ahead, Matt.
So I'll go ahead and tie into Scott's comments, and then we can hopefully move past that. So yeah, Mr. Armstrong is illustrating something that's happening actually in his area, which I've been engaged with tribes in that area that are having a problem with a provider who is coming in and has applied for FFA funding and is interested in serving their census blocks and is telling them verbally that they're going to serve their community with, X amount of service and X amount of connectivity and coverage, but there's no written agreement. There's no written proposal. There's no understanding of coverage. The tribe is being pressured into signing a letter of intent or support for this carrier, and tribes are very confused. So they're reaching out to people that they know to ask questions as to, what does this mean? Why are they doing this? And that is not proper engagement with the tribe. If you are going to serve a census block that is a tribal community, you should be engaged with the government. There's a process there where you interact with any other business or any other community. You should be engaging the stakeholders of that community and the government of that community that understand the needs and understand the values. So to go down the points, ensure complete coverage of the underserved or unserved area. So if the census block is, in that carrier's sweet spot and they would like to retain those funds for that, then, present a solution and then have a dialogue and listen to the needs of the community, of the tribe, and then come up with a final solution or an adjustment to solution that serves the complete census block at the coverage rates that are needed. Some of those tribes are also being told that they don't need more than 25.3, or they don't need more than what they have now. That is behavior unbecoming. So I think tribes know what they need. I think tribes understand the value of broadband, especially after the rest of the world got to see what it was like to not have broadband during COVID and be trapped at home. Tribes get it. We get it. We all figured it out, the value of this, and we know the needs of our education departments. We know the needs of our tribal governments and our businesses and our after school programs. So, don't tell the community what they need, because that's what you want to serve them with. Let's have an engagement process. So if a tribe is truly involved in the process and signs off on the the consent, then you won't have to deconflict overlapping proposals, because there won't be any. And then if project areas are predefined traffic areas like the tribal lands, I think we need to worry a little bit about definition, because tribes often have, like I said in the previous panel, there's populations that are outside the federal reservation boundary. So we might consider a definition of tribal lands that was used during the Obama administration, that was supportive of tribal communities that lived outside the boundaries of the federal reservation. And then I pose it to the CPUC to consider their state recognized tribes and how they would like to work with those. I think a representative from a state recognized tribe should probably be weighing in on this, and I'm not an expert in that space, but that's something that should be considered, because California has quite a few state recognized tribes. So thank you.
So thank you, Mr. Rantan, and thank you, Mr. Armstrong. And I didn't know if any of the carriers wanted to talk about how they're coordinating with local governments and what their perspective is on the point system in that regard.
I will just weigh in a little bit because I was going to address this in my comments anyway, but I agree that there should be coordination with the communities that you're going to be working with. I think the concern from a provider perspective is when you tie that coordination to ownership of the assets that are being built. And so I think as long as we can separate those two things, I think that we are fully in agreement with the counties and tribes that we're talking to today.
Thank you. And then one other question, and I think this goes to some comments that Ms. England from CCF and Ms. Odell from Cal Advocates on affordability. Can you talk a little bit more about how we can fully address the affordability issues, as the intent here is to get infrastructure out to unserved communities, but we do not rate regulate broadband service. And so in regards to how we can address our point system and balance that fact along with the comment that Ms. England had made regarding how we could potentially utilize our affordability proceeding to further address this issue, just wanted to hear what some of her thoughts were on that as well.
Sure.
Do you want to go?
Oh, yeah, no, Eileen, go ahead. I'll follow you.
Thanks, Shana. So first of all, I do want to be clear on the differences between a gate requirement, like a baseline requirement that's going to be required of all projects, and then these scoring criteria. Absolutely, I think that the gate requirements are going to be the strongest way to ensure all of these projects do deliver affordable service, and we think that that's best achieved through the required low-cost broadband service option, but also a very strong plan requirement for middle-class affordability. So those baseline requirements are how I think that we can best tackle affordability here. I don't think rate regulation is an issue. This is not rate regulation. This is a term of a grant. This is a contract term. And I think the courts are very clear that this is not regulation, and we should not be distracted by arguments to that effect.
I would add +1, +100, +1,000 to Eileen's point there. I think that the conversation or the concern that's raised about rate regulation is entirely misplaced and is a distraction we should just dismiss out of hand. There's no requirement that any company apply for or accept public money to build and operate their networks. So there is no rate regulation. We would concur also with public advocates on the gate approach. And then beyond that, in terms of the affordability rulemaking that exists and the reports, I just flagged that the last one that was done was in 2020. And I think the more recent PAO broadband pricing report, points to a real need for update there. And in terms of how to use it, I think that there should be a look at maybe thinking about where some of these affordability points or even a category of affordability points live is in areas that are of high affordability concern, or where the affordability ratios are of concern. And so I think, in terms of today here, kind of specific recommendations of what that would look like, I don't think we're prepared to make those. But broadly, there's clearly a wealth of very good data-based information within that rulemaking and within what should be updated reports to help drive that thinking.
Thank you. Mr. Gligola, Judge Gligola, did you have a question?
Excuse me, sure. Would it be possible to weigh in as well?
Yes, yeah, and yeah.
Okay.
So anyone else that wants to weigh in, let us know, and then we'll go to Judge Gligola.
Thank you. Just stepping back a little bit on the topic of affordability, to give context, Congress in the IIJA incorporated affordability in two ways. So first was the enactment of the Affordable Connectivity Program. And second is the requirement that all BEAD-funded providers provide a low-cost service option to then be able to take advantage of the Affordable Connectivity Program. And this approach is supported by longitudinal data from NTIA itself. Over year after year, the data shows that affordability is a barrier to broadband adoption, but is demonstrably the largest barrier for the lowest income residents. And that is exactly what ACP is designed to address. That's exactly what the low-cost service option is designed to address. Now, when it comes to affordability subgrantee selection criteria, we strongly propose that the state take the approach that other states have adopted as well, and use a tried and true method for determining affordability in high-cost broadband grant deployment programs, which is what the FCC has used for years. So in this respect, the Commission should be looking at an applicant's commitment to provide service and customers at rates that are consistent or reasonably comparable in subsidized areas that comparable to the rates that they provide in non-subsidized areas. It's the same thing, alternatively or in addition, making sure that those rates are consistent with the FCC's annual urban rate survey. Again, the design of this, which is in the Communications Act, is that consumers in high-cost areas to serve are not unduly footing the bill for more expensive broadband service. We want to make sure that that everybody that's connected to BEAD-funded networks are being served with high-quality, affordable broadband service on par with service that's available to existing customers in the state. What the state should avoid doing, and Commissioner Howe, thank you for recognizing the strict prohibition in the IIJA against rate regulation. We don't want the state to be benchmarking affordability against an arbitrary number, dollar amount. Again, going to the reasonable comparability standard, this is a standard that's been used for exactly these types of programs for a long time, and avoids any of the pitfalls for rate regulation. And I appreciate comments differing from a legal perspective as to whether or not this would constitute rate regulation, and we'd be happy to provide citations and a further discussion and comments in support of this. So thank you.
Commissioner Houck, I'll be very brief on your question. 3 sentences and no run-on sentence involved. So first, I believe there's roughly 109 federally recognized tribal communities in California, about another 40 on that have not sought federal recognition, and each with their own unique needs, but often in our most rural parts of California, and therefore the most difficult to serve. So we have to be especially sensitive to how we best partner from the beginning all the way through implementation and ongoing. We're working, for instance, one of the many tribes that Toronto Wireless is partnering with is the Round Valley tribal community, and that has been our approach with them. The third comment to Samuel's point on the ACP, that is currently probably going to run out April of 2024. Fortunately, President Biden is seeking an additional $6 billion for the ACP, which would at least get us to the end of 2024. But for those of us who believe in that more affordable service, $30 per household, $30 a month per household. For people of modest means in the United States, $75 per month for people in our tribal communities. We need to be working together to see that extended.
And I see lots of head shaking on that front.
Hopefully vertically and not horizontally.
Yes, I think I see lots of head nodding. I guess I'll
Good.
let people.
Commissioner, could I add something to that as well? Thank you. Yeah, I just want to respond to some of Samuel's comments as well. Notably, obviously, we're encouraged to hear, I think all of us, that the ACP, the White House has asked Congress to approve that $6 billion to run through 2024, but it's unclear if that's enough for that or, you know, whether that's going to get approved. And the second point I'd just like to add is, you know, affordability and broadband infrastructure are really inextricably linked. We've seen that from, you know, Markup, the reportive journalist, who said you may be paying more for less because there isn't as much competition or investment in these historically redline communities, which means, right, that providers can kind of charge what they like, or there's no competition driving those rates down. And we've also, with Oakland Undivided, have worked with Oakland Housing Authority and working with residents in public housing, and have seen that they are not actually receiving the speeds that they're paying for, which we're happy to share with folks as well. And again, that's largely due to monopolistic markets and there being only one provider option available for them.
I would like to also add that Greenlining is cautious about a lack of meaningful affordability provisions encouraging further pricing discrimination in digitally redlined communities. In the absence of meaningful affordability agreements, we've seen the proliferation of pricing discrimination where lower income areas actually are unduly subsidizing their wealthier peer neighborhoods, most notably in Los Angeles County. And we're concerned about the continuation of this practice with the BEAD program using publicly subsidized infrastructure projects.
Okay, thank you. Judge Glicola.
Thank you, Commissioner. So I want to ask our ISP panelists, kind of following up on a statement that was made by Ms. Singh, the term lifetime affordability. And what would be a stretch goal for your companies in terms of, I guess, a stretch goal for the term of the project? You know, how far can you use a certain price or assume that a certain price is what you would charge?
I'll start first, I guess. I think for us, when we're talking about the low-cost plan, which would be available to, right, at this point, it's people who are eligible for ACP, and Biden administration said that's about 40% of Americans. I unfortunately don't have the exact number for California, but use that as a rough number. While we understand the need to have perhaps a price at the start, I don't think any of us know of any product that keeps the same price for decades due to cost and labor, cost to make it, inflation. We've all been hearing about that for the past couple of years. So to the extent that there's a requirement for a price at the start of the program, we would assume that it would be recognized that you could increase that in a way that's reasonable based on cost increases to provide the same service.
And I would also note that the term useful life of the network assets is, in fact, it's a legal term of art. And if we look to how Treasury defined it for the ARPA broadband grant programs, they defined it as 8 years. So it takes into account issues of depreciation, tax, and so forth. So, but I agree with Meredith that in any event, we should be looking in light of just the factors that this is a vibrant marketplace, that there are mechanisms in place for, you know, just reasonable increases based on inflation.
But for how long? 8 years, 10 years?
Appreciate the question. I'd love to take it back to our member companies and can follow up in comments.
Okay.
Commissioner, there is one of our panels has their hand up, and I think then we're still continuing on with the rest of the panel. Yes. Okay. So Shayna, if you can, you have the floor. Shayna, if you're speaking, we can't hear you.
We still can't hear you. Maybe continue with our panel and come back. let's move on with the.
Could I just note maybe one thing on the affordability side, just some additional NTIA framing? So one thing I want to note is that, you know, I think we highlighted the requirements of the BEAD program to offer a low-cost service option, right? When we are looking at receiving a proposal from states, NTIA is looking for a defined number or a process to identify a defined number, right? When it comes to that low cost, we wanted to be able to actually substantiate the impact to the percentage of people, like what are you paying if you are ACP eligible? So we're expecting a number there, and we see that as a grant condition. So I do want to just emphasize that. There's a little bit more wiggle room when it comes to the middle class affordability approach and what that can look like. NTIA might, I mean, states can decide what they're going to propose, but we're allowing a little bit more flexibility there into what states are actually able to deliver to us. So I just want to be clear on those two requirements, how NTIA is going to review them when they are submitted. The other quick thing I just wanted to note on some of the tribal stuff is going back to Eileen's comment on gating versus scoring criteria. When we're talking about federal tribal lands, tribal resolution of consent is a gating criteria, right? That's not like you get extra points for doing that. That is a gating criteria in order to move forward. It looks a little bit differently when we're talking about how we get local government and that type of support, right? As we're discussing it now, we're discussing it in that it's, for states, it's meant to be part of that 25%. It's meant to be part of the points scoring criteria, right? Not necessarily default gating criteria. And the way, I think a key thing to note here is that's maybe a little bit different from FFA, though it's been a while since I've been in that program, and those program rules, is that when you're putting together points for these types, so for like if it's local government support, if it's letters, it's that kind of thing, if that gives you a significant points advantage when you're submitting an application, right, because you want that community support, it needs to be an option that is available for all types of providers to get. So a certain type of ownership structure, like only fully private companies you can't create criteria where only a fully private company or only a fully public company could get those points. So when you're thinking about it in terms of like local government support and writing a letter and that kind of thing, if we want that to be meaningful to what Scott's talking about, local governments need to know that they have the option to include or not include a letter, right? I think that this is a common ask for people in grants and that kind of thing, that sometimes local governments will just like, yeah, well, here's your letter, here's your form letter. But if we want it to be meaningful, if we want local governments and stakeholders to be able to kind of vote in a way that reflects the meaningful engagement an ISP or that locality itself has taken, then we need to make sure that local governments are sort of aware of how that scoring works and are able to give their support without it just being something that's sort of handed out de facto, or else it sort of devalues that on the scoring criteria. Right, but keep in mind, we are still developing the proposal. The state does have some flexibility. So these are comments we need to hear from you in developing that. And then when the written proposal's out, we will want to get your comments on the specific language that we're looking at proposing. So hearing from Mr. Armstrong and Mr. Rantanen about the importance of community support is definitely something we'll consider, but we need to hear from all of you on what this should look like for the areas that we do have some flexibility in deciding where the priorities are for California. So I just wanted to put that out there as well. And then I do think Ms. England, were we able to?
I am back. Thank you. Completely appropriately, my internet dropped. So just wanted to say a couple of things. One is I think that the comments and the kind of attempts at directing toward the ACP on behalf of industry is another really important place for the commission to look at its existing resources and research on this. So the PAO's broadband pricing report that just came out found very clear evidence that many of these providers actually monetized the ACP rather than pass that benefit on to its intended beneficiaries. So prices went up by $30 rather than having those $30 go to making that service more affordable. And that, again, is in data that the CPUC's PAO published very recently. So that's just one more example of how the PUC actually has a significant number of resources to lean on as it thinks about this affordability question. And then the second thing I wanted to add is just as we kind of contemplate what the rules might look like for kind of exceptions or saying things like, well, we can't build out everywhere because it's not affordable there, or, it's not financially feasible. I think this is another area where the PUC should be pretty expansive in terms of the kinds of data it considers. And I would offer one specific example. So AT&T's most recent filing to the SEC, they reported $8 billion in profit over that quarter on $3 billion of revenue. And they reported and in fact highlighted a 55.9% service profit margin on their mobile service. And I bring that up just as that is the kind of data that should actually be used when a company claims that they can't build to a specific area or within a specific street because it's not financially feasible. So that was all I wanted to add. Thank you.
Thank you. In the interest of time, let's move on with the rest of our panelists to provide their comments on the questions, and hopefully we have a few minutes at the end of this panel for more Q&A. So let's turn to Matt Rentinen from Tribal Broadband.
Hi, Matt Rentinen from Tribal Digital Village, Southern California Tribal Chairmen's Association. I made most of the points in response to the previous questions. I feel like, additional scoring criteria would be affordability. It's been mentioned before, but affordability for tribes is key. They're in situations where, poverty is greater than 55% in California tribes, and a lot of people can't afford even the lowest tier of internet. When we're talking about speeds of 100 down, 20 up, I think that speed threshold should be the low tier of internet service, not the high tier of internet service. That should be the base offering when we're moving forward, and I think it offers the opportunity for tribes to operate at today's standards, or today's, hopefully average standards of internet access, so that they can compete educationally, resource acquisition as well as job training and things on the internet. So if that ACP valued tier could be higher than 120, or at the minimum of 120, 100 down and 20 up, I think that really benefits tribes moving forward. And then, just rereading the last question and post-application process. I don't know how to phrase this without, just being, very tribal centric, but I'm very tribal centric, and that is that if the tribe has a solution and the tribe is, decides to be the carrier of last resort, or the carrier that serves this community, then I think the tribe should be given that opportunity. I don't know how else to phrase that. So thank you.
Thank you, Matt. Now turn to our panelists from ISPs. Meredith?
Thank you, and thank you again for having me here today. Just to start, I want to sort of frame our points, and then I'll go into a little bit more detail on the question. So the IIJA created the BEAD program as a means of reducing the number of U.S. households that lack access to reliable high-speed broadband. And the extent to which California can address this with the BEAD program will depend significantly on the rules that the Commission adopts to implement it. As Mariana pointed out earlier, NTIA has allowed states some discretion in adopting rules that will govern the allocation of BEAD funding, but we encourage the Commission to refrain from its
limited discretion to impose additional criteria or requirements that stray from the program's objectives and priorities, which is to connect as many Californians to reliable high-speed broadband as possible. Instead, the Commission's initial proposal should leverage BEAD funding to efficiently bring broadband service that is as future-proof as possible to the greatest number of Californians while minimizing the risk of default. So what we've seen in some other states, and I know some of the other panelists have referenced those already, is that many of them are proposing to do a pre-qualification round for BEAD, where they measure the operational, managerial, and technical capabilities of applicants prior to putting the areas out for application. Establishing standards that are challenging but achievable, and reviewing all applicants' qualifications in full before allowing them to participate in the BEAD competitive funding process will ensure that the broadband projects that are proposed actually get completed. In terms of defining project areas, to ensure an efficient use of funds, the Commission should allow applicants to combine unserved and underserved locations into logical project areas that the applicants define. And this is because providers are in the best position to design project areas that will make the most cost-effective use of existing infrastructure and will minimize the number of new permits and rights-of-way and speed deployment, helping Californians connect to reliable high-speed broadband sooner rather than later. However, we recognize that there is a desire to incentivize deployment to locations that might otherwise get overlooked. And so we believe there are a couple of opportunities for the Commission to do this without further defining project areas. This would be creating incentives for applicants to include economically or geographically challenging areas in their project areas. One is high-cost areas, and NTIA has already permitted states to waive the match requirement for those high-cost areas in order to incentivize deployment there. The state could also identify priority locations that they want to make sure are served by these projects that may be in persistent poverty counties or within a community that's determined by the Census Bureau to be in economic need. And to incentivize deployment to those priority locations, they could award additional points using the discretionary scoring to encourage providers to include some percentage of those locations in their applications. If the Commission were to do that, we'd encourage them to identify in advance and publish points that an application could earn by going to those locations. If the Commission does feel that they need to define project areas in some way, we encourage them to do it with the smallest geographic unit possible, preferably a census block, which I think has been raised by others here. Requiring every provider to serve every eligible location in a large area would necessitate that providers deploy significantly beyond their existing footprints. And the need for a total new build could increase the total average cost and the total subsidy needed to reach some of these locations, unnecessarily driving up costs and how much money can be used to deploy end-to-end fiber to as many locations as possible. In addition, by using smaller geographic units, this can allow for all companies of all sizes to participate, including those that do not have a large footprint at this point. On affordability, I just want to go back really briefly to the comments about the ACP program and point out that AT&T has the access from AT&T service for the class option, which is $30 a month. And so combined with ACP, that's actually $0. Other than having a $0 plan to start with, I don't think there's a way we could have driven up that cost by $30 with the advent of the ACP program. But we also recognize that the BEAD NOFO requires states to judge affordability based on the 1 gigabit tier. And so we would concur with Cal Broadband's comments along to use the Urban Rate Survey benchmark as a comparison. 2 other quick points on the minimal BEAD outlay question. Simply giving the highest number of points to projects to propose the least amount of funding will continue to deprioritize high-cost areas. And so we think that there's a way to balance both the need to minimize program funding, but also encourage deployment to higher cost areas by splitting the way these points are used, for half being based on the amount of match offered and half being based on the number of unserved locations in identified high cost locations, therefore getting more deployment to these high cost locations. And then finally, I just want to reiterate that we welcome collaboration with local governments and communities and tribal communities, and will continue to do that as we deploy broadband across the state. But if the commission decides to allocate points for these collaborations, we just would like them to be clear that the rules, in the rules that the applicant, whether alone or in collaboration, that will ultimately provide service to the end user may retain sole ownership of the infrastructure. Thank you again for having us.
Thank you. Carl, please go ahead.
Thank you, and thank you again to Commissioner Houck and to our ALJ for bringing us together today. I always rate a panel on how much I learn, and I've learned so much from this panel, both in the room and online. So I just wanted to comment really quickly to Matthew. On the screen, on the earlier panel, you mentioned the importance of low latency for interactive video, and I couldn't agree with that point more, so I just wanted to reinforce that as well, how critical that is. And your comments about 100 by 20 being the floor, the foundation, and not the overall goal. And in that way, we future-proof for future needs that families and communities have. So again, I try not to be presumptuous about a small technology company that's pre-public, Toronto Wireless, Carl Gordino, 14 years old, created in 2009 by 3 PhD graduate students who were earning those PhD degrees as part of the international program at UC Berkeley. Go Bears! And fast forward 14 years, $400 million in privately funded research and development later. In just the past 2 years, Toronto is serving previously unserved and underserved families in 21 countries, 45 states, numerous tribal nations, with nearly 300 ISP customer partners. And we can have other conversations about the technology, and I brought something to pass out and for the record on the technology. But I want to go to the questions on if applicants are allowed to construct their own project areas. Based on our experience in digital divide projects, now several hundred across the U.S. and around the world, we believe at Toronto that allowing providers to invent their own optimal or cherry-picked coverage areas and locations will create an untenably complex and practically irreconcilable mix of proposals for the target and underserved areas, making fair award decisions impossible and yielding to failure to fulfill the BEAD program's objective of reaching 100% of unserved and underserved households. I had the pleasure at lunch of being on the phone with Courtney Dozier at the NTIA, and she reminded me, Carl, the program is Internet for all. It's not Internet for some. We have to get the verses out of our language and replace it with and. It's not rural versus urban, as Patrick so well summarized this morning. It's and. It's all of us in California. It's 996,302 places. And we can learn from others and best practices. I've now read 18 state broadband plans. Page turners, all of them. What Kansas is doing in their initial proposal on this, they're going by school districts. So they cover their whole state, and it can't be cherry-picked. And if you have a big districts like LA, then maybe you go by the sub-districts that people run under, and same with LA Unified, so that you've covered the whole state, but no one can cherry-pick. The next question is on deconflicting overlapping proposals. As noted, we're strong supporters of defining coverage areas in need clearly in advance so that we eliminate the problem of deconfliction altogether. Takes it right off the table. The next question is on project areas are predefined, et cetera. As also noted above, having our PUC set target project areas based on existing geographic areas, school districts, census tracts, block groups that contain and underserved locations ensures that providers do not cherry pick. I loved that point that Eileen O'Dell made earlier about that, and we agree completely with that. And in that way, we're serving hard to reach locations, therefore much more expensive locations, and that they cannot be denied of what they should have under broadband for all. The next question is around required scoring criteria, and I'm going to go back to Matthew's excellent point. Make 100 by 20 the floor, because we're going to continue to grow the need. At Toronto, we think, okay, if 100 by 20 is the floor, then maybe in scoring criteria, the next is 200 by 50, or 400, and then 400 by 100, and then a gigabit by 250. But keep those so that we're looking forward to the future of families and communities' needs. The next question is around additional scoring criteria, such as awarding points on the basis of equity, climate resilience. We agree on all of that. And again, remember, the bipartisan infrastructure law is internet for all. The governor's executive order is around broadband for all being the key. And Caroline's points from the Greenlining Institute of once-in-a-lifetime funds, we can't forget that. This truly is once in a lifetime. The state funds, the federal funds, current and future through the $1.86 billion, all. And we can do it if we do the math right with technologies that are based on what they can provide in terms of reliable and affordable service. By the way, I have printed out the questions and my responses so that you have it for the record, and we can stay within the 5 minutes. So I'll pass those around here to the panel, the people in the audience. If people remotely would like it, we are completely transparent at Toronto. Just let me know the email address through the staff here of the PUC, and we'll get it to you. The last is around the post-application process. I'm going to just keep that on what I have written here, but I want to go to Scott Armstrong's point from rural Inyo County and Gracie's point from RCRC earlier. 40 of California's 58 counties are completely rural. The other 18 have rural areas, but those are completely rural. That's 1 of every 5 Californians. It's 60% of our land mass in our rural counties. Not completely, but are overwhelmingly more expensive to serve. Topography, geography, distance. And they are overwhelmingly, not completely, but overwhelmingly, people of color and often of more financial modest means. We cannot afford to miss those communities when we move forward with an and approach rather than a versus approach of serving everyone. So let's not forget, technology advances, and it has, which is a point Marina made earlier about fiber or fixed wireless or satellite, standards-based. Fiber is preferred, and we agree with that, which you may not expect to hear from a fixed wireless company, but we do. Fiber everywhere you can, as long as it is cost effective and can be deployed in a timely manner. Second point, along with technology advances, is finances are finite. And that's why your good work together is we have to leverage limited dollars. And we think from the final 5-year action plan, thanks for your transparency in that plan, we could be as much as $5 billion short. We actually think it's more than that. With inflation and labor shortage issues and supply chain issues, it's probably more than that. But we have to get to all 996,302. And the final one is quick deployment matters. I hate to make it personal, but we have a 7-year-old in first grade who we foster adopted at 3 months old from a homeless woman somewhere in Silicon Valley. If we solely depended on a fiber to the premise approach, as good as fiber is, he would be in 5th to 7th grade if we hadn't run out of money before we would have fiber to the home in all of California. We can't afford to lose another generation, whether tribal, rural, suburban, or urban. So thanks for letting me be on this panel. It's really been an honor. And I'll pass around my written comment.
Great. Thanks, Carl. And our last panelist, Sam.
Thanks so much. Again, my name is Sam Eklund. I'm from Wilkie Farr & Gallagher, counsel to Comcast, and here on behalf of Cal Broadband. Commissioner Hauk, Director Osborne, and Judge Gligola, and all the staff, we thank you for the opportunity to participate in this workshop and for all the work you're doing to fulfill this generational opportunity presented by the BEAD program. Congress, NTIA, and the Commission have made clear that the number one purpose of the BEAD program is to connect all unserved and underserved locations in the state. And this is a monumental task. As the CPUC explained in the 5-year action plan, this is at least over 450,000 locations. And Carl just brought up the elephant in the room. You know, while $1.86 billion allocated to California is a lot of money relative to what was allocated to other states in the country, there's still a staggering multi-billion-dollar gap that the state recognized in the 5-year action plan. It's a huge gap to a huge bridge. Gap to bridge, particularly if the state is looking to fulfill the directive to connect as many locations as possible with end-to-end fiber, and do so in a way that's going to ensure not only that these projects get built, but looking beyond the build, that they will be managed and operated in a sustainable manner for many years to come. So Cal Broadband offers our comments today on ways to ensure that the subgrantee selection process through the project selection, design, the primary criteria, and secondary criteria are designed to bridge this multi-billion-dollar gap. We want to make sure that the state retains enough money to connect all unserved locations, let alone underserved locations in the state. On project selection, we strongly encourage that the Commission allow applicants to define their own project areas in the initial round of funding. This will, as Meredith described eloquently, this will allow shovel-ready projects that can leverage existing networks to hit the ground, be competitive, be efficient, and it's going to be saving the state substantial money on the front end. Now, this is not cherry picking. The IIJ is clear that all unserved and underserved locations in the state must be served. So this will allow providers to put forth their very best options that will save the state money on the front end, allow fiber to get deeper and deeper into the state, and obviate the need to utilize the extremely high cost threshold later on in the selection process. Now, from there, depending on how many unserved or underserved locations are left after those initial proposals, the state can either work with providers to expand those remaining locations, or can then take those remaining areas and sort them into project areas for competitive bidding in a subsequent round of funding. So again, this is not cherry picking. This will ensure every location is accounted for. It's just going to save the state money and allow BEAD funds to go a lot further and allow fiber to go a lot further in the state. To that end, on primary criteria, Cal Broadband strongly urges the state to prioritize minimal BEAD outlay in the selection criteria. So as the NOFO says, the NOFO directs states to rigorously explore ways to incentivize higher matches and matches greater than the minimum 25%. Doing so, again, is going to be critical and the most efficient way to be able to bridge this multi-billion-dollar gap and make sure that this funding gets to every unserved and underserved location in the state. I think it's instructive to take a look at what Illinois has done. Illinois is another large state, highly populous state, and they've allocated 50% to the minimum BEAD outlay criterion. we urge the state to consider doing the same. We've gotten into affordability. I do also want to echo Meredith's response. You know, speaking on behalf of Comcast here, Comcast has offered Internet Essentials for over 12 years, long before EBB or ACP was even offered. Internet Essentials Plus provides 100 over 20 service for $30, effectively cost-free for ACP subscribers. So again, there's really no credence to the idea that providers are looking to monetize off ACP. It's intended to provide high-quality broadband service at no cost to those qualifying customers. It's also, in terms of data, notwithstanding the fact that this country has seen inflation over the past few years that has not been seen for decades, month after month over the past couple of years, the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics data shows that broadband prices have had a deflationary effect. As opposed to gas, electricity, food at home, other household staples, broadband at no point was driving inflation. So put a pin on that. With respect to the labor primary subgrantee selection criterion, we just want to briefly state that Cal Broadband providers' incentives are aligned with all other stakeholders, that we want to attract the very best in a limited, currently limited pool of shovel-ready workforce for broadband deployment. The state recognized in the 5-year action plan that this is a significant barrier. So California law sets a very high bar for labor standards. The NOFO also sets a very high bar, just at a baseline. We urge the state, in considering the Fair Labor Practices selection criterion, to stick with the requirements in the NOFO, looking at a record of fair labor practices and plans for future compliance. With respect to the number of optional encouragements that NTIA offers, we urge the state to take a flexible approach there, understanding that it's a highly competitive labor market. We want to build the best, highest quality, provide high quality jobs, high quality training, with which our members do, but also understanding that these projects need to get built and need under pretty tight deadlines.
If you can wrap up in 30 seconds.
Okay, yeah. Just very briefly, in terms of other criteria to consider, technical, operational, managerial, financial capacity is a gating threshold, but the state shouldn't stop there. This is really important. We need to be making sure that the investment made in these networks is sustainable and will last a long time. A state like Delaware has proposed additional criteria for experience in fulfilling commitments and deploying broadband networks. That's something the state should consider. The state should also consider additional criteria for projects that propose to serve a greater number of unserved and underserved locations. The IIJA has very strict overbuilding limits. No more than 20% of a project area can be served. That being said, the state should be incentivizing projects to propose a much lower percentage to make sure that, again, these limited dollars are spent efficiently and in a manner that's going to preserve the opportunity for the state to fund fiber as deep into the state as possible. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sam. So that concludes our panelists. Just quickly checking with Jonathan if we have anything online. We don't. Commissioner, Judge, any questions?
I do have a couple of questions, but I wanted to turn it over to Director Osborne. I think he has a question that he wanted to ask.
Thank you, and I really wanted to see if Kaylee Gow wanted to comment on the workforce development requirements that are called out in the NTIA NOFO. I believe under the CWA comments on the ruling, they quoted the NTIA as encouraging states to consider scoring applicants on job quality and job training. And I think the workforce development is a key component that hasn't really been touched on here in terms of what should the state require BEAD applicants with regard to workforce development, because building the networks is a one-time thing, and then the next step is maintaining those networks, and not having the workforce in place to build them again is one issue, but there's the other issue of developing a workforce that can operate these networks and also providing employment and training for disadvantaged communities. Thank you.
Thank you. Are you able to hear me now?
Yes.
Great. I adjusted the settings. I've been in contact with IT. So thank you so much for the opportunity to respond on this point. And we definitely do encourage viewing the points structure as considering fair labor practices as itself a workforce development tool. We know that funds are limited, and of course, there aren't likely to be extra funds for workforce development after all the other priority areas. In how the CPUC chooses to structure its points system, it will be incentivizing employers to take different high road labor practices. So as opposed to viewing these as nice to have additional encouragements in the NTIA NOFO, CWA would say they really align with the broader goals of workforce development and a sustainable workforce to, as you're saying, maintain the network going forward. In incorporating high road labor factors into the point system, the commission would be incentivizing high road labor practices that will encourage employers to invest in a locally based workforce, a well-trained workforce. That's going to support workforce development in the long term of good jobs in California necessary to maintain the network in the long term.
Director Osborne, if I may, and this is Carl wearing his CTC, California Transportation Commission hat on Kaylee's point, not Tirana, just because I've never socialized at Tirana. But I hope this will also include people in our communities. As someone who deeply believes in second chances for formerly incarcerated individuals in California as part of that workforce training.
Hi, Matt. We see you have your hand up.
Yes, thank you. I wanted to also address Rob Osborne's comments or question. So workforce development is a key aspect of Indian country. We are working with populations that sometimes have not been exposed to the field of technology or the building of infrastructure broadband. This is a very functional field for tribal members, especially when they're going to build out some of their own solutions. But in situations where outside partners might be building in their regions or building even in their communities, there's great opportunity to teach as well as build. So build some of these solutions. So teaching increases the value of some of the solutions that are being deployed, and we think that shadowing opportunities, training opportunities are very valuable in this space, especially with those agreements where an outside vendor may be building assets on tribal community land, on sovereign land, and they may have an agreement to transfer the assets of the network to the tribe at a 3 or 5 year period based on like recovery of funds, etc. And having a training program in that 3 to 5 year period where tribal members learn the process and understand the process of deployment and management of that network to be able to take that over and not miss a stride in managing that service. And then there's also the fact that there's TARO, which is the tribal employment requirement, and many tribes are very adamant about their TARO opportunity and hiring tribal workforce when in and around tribal regions. So I just wanted to hammer that. I mean, it's no secret that I run the tribal broadband boot camps, and those are very instrumental in illustrating to tribes the base level understanding of what it takes to run a network and where to start with workforce development planning and growth. So thank you.
Thank you. Commissioner, questions?
Yes, I've got a question for Ms. Williams and Mr. Eklund. I think you both commented, I think Ms. Williams, you commented on looking at combining served and unserved areas to provide the most cost-effective use of funds. And Mr. Eklund, you commented on we should be allowing applicants to define project areas in first round of funding to leverage existing networks. Can you talk about what combining served and unserved areas could look like, whether that would be in compliance with the NOFO and looking at serving unserved areas? And then as a follow-up, and I can repeat this, Mr. Eklund, you talked about states should work with providers to serve these remaining high-cost isolated areas. So I think you're saying first round looking at how you can leverage existing networks, and then later looking at how we can address the remaining higher cost, more isolated areas. Can you talk about how that would be done, and given the lack or limited funding that we have here, what that would mean for those areas that are higher cost and more isolated? I hope, if you need me to repeat any of that, I appreciate it. I can do that.
Happy to address that. And and if I miss anything, please let me know. So first I'll just say, and Marina can tell me if I'm wrong, but I believe I'm quoting your colleagues at NTIA, that they've been very clear that the requirement for unserved and underserved in the NOFO is not a temporal requirement. It's not a requirement to go build to all the unserved locations and then come back and build to all the underserved. It is, I think I've heard it described once as a budgeting exercise, which I think diminishes the amount of work that goes into that. But to the extent to say we know we have enough money to cover all these locations, so we can also cover these other locations. And so I think what we would propose is that, applicants would be able to combine unserved and underserved, because oftentimes, you kind of will likely have a donut effect, right? You're going to have unserved locations as sort of the donut hole, and then underserved locations surrounding them, and then likely the infrastructure to get there is outside of that donut. And so from an efficiency perspective, it doesn't make sense to define a project to get to the donut hole and then come back and define a different project to get to the donut, especially if you look at using two different providers, so their network infrastructure is kind of crossing over each other. So that was really the intent we were talking about there. But please let me know if I didn't address your question.
No, I think you did. I guess that would mean a question to Marina, and I don't know if you're prepared to answer that. If we're looking at the prioritizing the unserved areas, if a project came in, as Ms. Williams described, that could fill a donut hole and would also be serving unserved areas before other unserved areas, would that be a project that meets the BEAD requirements?
So I think there's some nuance here when it comes to states that don't think they will make it to all of their underserved, because, NTIA does say you have to meet, prioritization-wise, it's unserved, underserved community anchor institutions. But that said, I think in terms of, again, budgeting exercise is probably not the best term specifically here, but NTIA also doesn't want to segment things out in terms of you have to wait to all of the unserved applications to get covered in order to then do the underserved, in order to then do the thing. I think it's looking at the total amount of funding you have, looking at these total numbers that you have and where you're going to end up with, and trying to figure out sort of where that cutoff is going to be. But a project itself doesn't necessarily have to. I think we're expecting project bids to come in for unserved and underserved at the same time, and in some cases combine those locations, because otherwise it's going to be challenging to make feasible projects. But I think that there is probably a little bit more discussion to be had in terms of what does serving the unserved actually look like order-wise, if it's not just you have to wait to deploy until, because we don't necessarily want it to be sequential. We just want the plan to be to get to everywhere.
Right, and I guess that's my concern. If we have just enough money to get to all the unserved without addressing underserved, I'm just not sure where the balance is in trying to get the projects that make sense in if we have other restrictions about where the money has to go first. So I think just being able to have those conversations about how to balance that and where we need to go, because we do have limited funding, but we do want to use it as in the smartest possible way to get the most people served as quickly as possible in the most logical order.
And to that point, you know, the NOFO does contemplate that in high-cost areas, as Marina was explaining, the distinction between extremely high threshold and high-cost areas, that those may be so difficult to serve that it may not be appropriate to seek matching funds there. That's all the more reason that the state needs to incentivize for non-high-cost areas as rigorous matching funds as possible. There will be, as much as the state can save money on the moving from inside out to those rural and remote areas where the state knows that it's going to be spending a disproportionate amount of the BEAD funds, the most effective, efficient way for the state to ensure that there is that money to serve the rural and remote areas is to make sure that we're rigorously incentivizing higher matching funds and lower minimal BEAD outlays in those intermediate areas.
And Commissioner Hauk, thank you. On the ISP side of the panel, even though we're a technology company, not an ISP, this is a math problem, and it's very doable. The NTIA is very clear in the 95-page BEAD NOFO that there's a preference for fiber. There's not a requirement for fiber. There's a requirement for reliable, affordable, high speed, and I agree again with Matthew, low latency, even though that's not in there, home broadband. And the math works if we stick to a standards 100 by 20 as a floor and hopefully much better approach rather than a technology approach. The math works, and we would be happy to enter into the record after this for both the construction and ongoing maintenance and operations that the math works when we take a hybrid approach that picks the right tool for the job for that family and that community to stretch the funds we have. We do not have to make a choice of broadband for some rather than what the bipartisan infrastructure law is, as well as the governor's executive order of broadband for all.
No, thank you. I do have a question about looking at where and how we should be addressing the issue of fiber and fixed wireless. I was going to save that to the next panel where we're looking at high cost, but just really quickly before we get there, I just wanted to go back to Mr. Eklund. So when you were talking about the state should work with providers to serve the remaining high cost in the more isolated areas, was that what you were referring to, is that in the later rounds to be looking at a higher percentage of match to help, or what was the mechanisms that you were thinking the state could be looking at to help incentivize how we get to serving those higher cost isolated areas?
Sure. So I think it all depends on, at the end of if round one is a provider or applicant proposed areas, it's unclear, but we could be in a situation where there's only small pockets of unserved and underserved locations left after scoring and awarding the best applications and, in a kind of sequential manner, a highest scoring applicant gets preference for all the areas that it proposes to serve and going down the list. So that could result in a scenario where there's only kind of smaller pockets of unserved and underserved locations. The commission could go back to those provisional awardees and say, hey, would you be willing to incorporate this set of locations adjacent to your proposal into your application? If there's If there are larger pockets, then it could very well make sense to parcel those out into project area units for a subsequent round. And then again, everyone would get another bite at the apple to then take those remaining locations and put forth their best applications to serve them. And do so as long as, it may take another round or two. And if there are still pockets that it looks like the state, that no one's proposing to serve yet, the NOFO is clear that the state can take measures to, induce through waivers of matching funds or other incentives to make sure that every location is served.
So just for an example, I think at the Middle Mile meeting and recently we've received a lot of comments about the Big Sur area being unserved. And so to the extent there may be projects that are close to that location, you're saying to go back and have staff to have conversations with providers to see whether that area or another area similar to that, close to a similar project, could be tied in.
Yeah, exactly. And again, the motivation behind this is to incentivize the most efficient use of funds. What we would caution against starting with predefined areas is those may, even the smallest areas as a census block group, could not take into account topography, infrastructure, existing infrastructure like railroads or other rights of way, waterways that could just make things impractical to serve in that defined geographic area. So again, it wouldn't be excluding any location. It would just be tiering the ways that every location eventually gets, allocated funds.
No, that makes sense. And the geographic areas is another reason to discuss, and I'll wait for the next panel on my question on the fixed wireless, but that also, in addition to high cost, is.
And wouldn't it be boring if we always agreed? We believe it would lead to cherry picking and inefficiency because that requires many extra rounds instead of doing it all at once so we can get this money out in the street while making sure that we're all responsible for serving every unserved and underserved California.
Just one last thing, Commissioner, on your point in your question, sort of an additional clarification in terms of like estimating how much money we have to get to unserved and underserved. I think NTIA is expecting a good faith showing, so that is going to mean when it comes to, we're going to ask states to solicit applications for both unserved and underserved and understand what those costs look like before we work with states in terms of figuring out like what does it look like if you can't reach all unserved and underserved, right? So understanding like the feasibility and the cost that comes in with that first round, for example, of applications. We wouldn't recommend just full off saying we're not going to put the underserved locations on the map for possible bidding, but to put them both out. And then from there, looking at the results, trying to figure out how we balance the amount of funding received in terms of doing the math to make sure that we're getting the maximum amount of coverage with unserved taking the top priority. Thank you.
Thank you.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Could I add thank you for your time. If I could add just one final point on the, if we're considering a predefined area, whether, again, hopefully in the subsequent round, several states, including Pennsylvania and Montana, have also incorporated a mechanism to allow applicants to de-scope certain limited areas within a proposed area on the basis of it being an overbuild or being extremely high cost that would otherwise kind of skew the overall cost per passing in a given project area. So again, this would not be saying that we're not going to serve that area at all, but within an application, be able to de-scope a proposal and then be able to have another conversation subsequently about making sure any existing gaps get filled in. Thank you.
Okay, no, thank you. And I do appreciate that you were looking at ways to how we can get to some of these donut holes that have been particularly problematic, especially in some of the urban areas as well as the rural areas that we need to definitely reach. Commissioner, can I just add one thing there as well? Just representing the community from a community perspective, especially when we're talking about ISPs leveraging their existing networks, we are really concerned about ISPs being able to build their own project areas, given CPUC's own network exam findings that incumbent ISPs disproportionately invest in multi-year communities. So that would be of concern to Oakland Undivided.
Commissioner Sheena has her hand raised as well online. Sheena?
On behalf of CCF, would agree with Georgia that there is some concern about reliance on existing infrastructure, since that infrastructure clearly already serves folks, and has to look down on where there's gaps. But just want to speak again on behalf of the community groups, since we have communicated about this on the matching front. Our concern around the matching is that it may be used to effectively disqualify local, municipal, community-based organizations, education agencies, and other qualified public-serving organizations that may be building networks using public dollars for public benefit. And so while appreciate the Comcast and Broadband and AT&T's concern about efficient use of public dollars, want to suggest that something that might be helpful here, if it were allowed by the NTIA, is almost like a bifurcated recognition, so that if there is, for example, projects in project areas that, if there are project areas that are only proposed being served by a private provider, then sure, prioritize. If they want to take out of their profits to build in that area, that's a terrifically efficient use of public money. But where you have projects that are being proposed to serve by public serving entities using other pockets of public dollars, that there should be some sort of exception or kind of accommodation for that matching requirement.
Thank you. Any other questions, comments? Commissioner, Judge, Director? Thank you. That concludes our second panel of the day. I want to thank you all our panelists. We have one more panel 3, extremely high cost per location threshold, but we are going to take 90 minutes break. Let's take a break, come back at 3:15.